Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, Patty Rose. My guest today, coming all the way from Scotland, is Colin Johnston. Colin, welcome to the show.
Hey, Patty. Thanks for having me, dude.
I said that you were in Scotland, but you came from Scotland. You are now living in Eugene, Oregon, so you're one of us now.
I am. Technically Springfield.
Me too. In an undisclosed location.
My wife doesn't let me tell people it's Springfield because she grew up in Eugene.
That's so funny because I grew up in Springfield, and now I used to be that way, and now I would be ashamed to say I live in Eugene. I think that it's flipped. But thanks for doing this. I came across you through the work that I do with the Democratic Party of Lane County. I think you are officially a PCP. Is that correct?
I am not. No, okay. I am just. I help out. I am general dog's body, so little bits of design, mostly volunteering.
Right. It's cool.
I know we're going to talk about immigration in a bit, so I'll explain why I'm not named.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm a Precinct Committee Person for the Democratic Party of Lane County, and basically all I do is the podcast. I don't really do anything else to help anything, but I go to meetings and I learn a lot and I network, and you're one of the people that is now attending our meetings and bring something completely different to the table. And that's what I love about the DPLC in Lane County. The Democratic Party has a huge umbrella of people just with all different experiences and walks of life. So it's really cool. So let's get into it. We have a lot to talk about. You immigrated. Let's talk about your immigration, and then we'll talk about some of your education research. So
sure.
So tell me about how you decided to move to Eugene specifically.
So Eugene specifically, my wife's grew up here. So born and raised out other side of Eugene from here. She went to U of O, and then when she went to grad school in Kansas, deliberately to get her PhD, then come back, and that was like 2004. And we just got back here last summer. So we came up from Austin, Texas. I was doing my master's in education down there. Stacey was working, and then COVID hit. We both went remote. We came up here for a 3-week vacation last June, so June 2020. And about a week and a half into the vacation, we both were like, let's just stay. Let's just not go back. So we did. And actually, today is the year anniversary of me driving all of our stuff back up from Austin. Wow.
So now, Texas. Now, going from Scotland to Texas had to have been a tremendous culture shock. So tell me about that.
So I spent a lot of time, I was a study abroad director, admissions director in higher ed back home for 10 years. And so I spent a lot of time out here in the States. That being said, it was weird. And I think my biggest culture shock was expecting Austin to be more liberal than it was. Now, don't get me wrong, like Austin is liberal by Texas standards. Like, there's no debating that. But like, it's not liberal by any other metric. Like Eugene, Springfield feel liberal to me, even like with the elements of the right wing we've got here, which weren't necessarily seen in Austin. I feel like this is a much more liberal city.
Yeah.
And the heat, man, the heat.
Well, it's hard to complain about heat somewhere else right now in Oregon because it's brutal. I mean, but it's temporary.
We're going to hit 35 degrees Celsius today. Y'all can do the conversion.
Yeah, I don't even know what that means. So now I talked briefly. You've worked as an education researcher. You had mentioned that you got your master's in education at the University of Texas at Austin, but also 2 law degrees at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, with a focus on equity and inclusion, using CRT as a framework. And so I want to talk today a little bit about critical race theory. What your interpretation? It's such a hot button issue, and people's hair catches fire when we talk about it. But first of all, when you say that you're an education researcher, what does that mean?
Yeah, one thing very quickly: Edinburgh.
Edinburgh.
Okay. Yep. Y'all going to Ireland soon. You'll get beat down if you throw heavy G's around, man.
Sure. No hard R's either, but. Anyway, so what would Edinburgh?
So
okay,
education research. Realize so I'm trained as a social studies teacher. Got my certifications. I'm ESL, so English as a second language certified. But really, my research was sparked by, so the degree I was doing was urban teaching. It was specifically geared to work in inner city schools, particularly, but primarily schools with high percentages of students of colour, non-traditional students, English language learners, or low socioeconomic status. So, for example, the last school I taught in was 75% Latinx, about 20% black, and the remaining 5% were either two races or more Asian Pacific Islander, and like 0.5%, 1% white. Of all of those kids, like 70% were considered below the poverty line, and 30% of those kids had no fixed home, and were sort of called mobile. And a lot of the stuff that I saw those kids facing, like a lot of the little issues and the things that were going on in the schools, were the same things that I saw when I grew up in Scotland, just coloured by race instead of religion. And in my readings, I was like, I understand a lot of this, but despite being a white, working class, lower middle class guy, there was so much of the struggles and the issues that students were facing. I was like, yeah, I totally see where you're coming from. And I'd started my career working with non-traditional students in Scotland, so sort of first generation kids. I loved doing that. I was a first generation kid. Both me and my brother were the first of our family ever to go to college. Now both first in our family tree ever to have master's degrees. Like my grand's like, y'all are like, I don't even understand.
So by first generation, that's what you mean, right? You're talking about first generation, like educated, yeah.
Yeah. And so I really enjoyed working with those kids, and I got to the point in my career where I wasn't talking to students anymore. I was doing pretty high level strategy and working with like principals and deans instead of the kids. And I realized I was like, I actually miss their honesty and some of the stuff they come out with.
Yeah.
And I've been looking for a career change, found the degree at UT. Stacey had got the job in Austin, so we're like, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's give it a try.
And a lot of times, yeah, I mean, the work you can be doing, a lot of work on a big scale, but sometimes that feels like you're not making that human connection, So are you trying to get back into teaching at a high school level?
The plan is to teach, hopefully continue to get my PhD. But my research is actually sort of really focused in on, it's good that you mentioned like making a difference. It's focused on, so it's using a critical race lens theory, but looking at ways of making culturally responsible and culturally sustaining pedagogies, democratic education. I'm a huge fan of the idea of like the socially justice orientated student, where you teach kids skills. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of people who don't understand CRT get wrong. You all know me, cards on the table. I am left wing. I believe in socialised healthcare. I am the antithesis to the Republican Party. But if there's a kid with Republican values in my class, I'm not going to be like, you're wrong. The whole concept of my research, my work, is that you teach a kid the skills to critically analyse something. Doesn't matter what that is. Like you hear a lot of people like, I've done my research. Like, no, you've looked at a video on Facebook, maybe YouTube if you're lucky. Research is actually sitting down, reading peer-reviewed papers, getting out into schools, talking to kids, talking to people, understanding the theory behind it. And that's kind of what I want to do. I want to work with the students in the communities that actually need assistance right now.
So with critical race theory, was that something that you learned in Scotland, or was that something you learned when you got here? Because that's mostly focused on America, is that correct?
Yeah, so CRT, I know Aisha spoke about it last week, has its groundings with Derek Bell in the law schools on the East Coast. And actually, I think this is something that I haven't really heard anyone say anything about. No one's really said, here's what CRT is in education. So actually, I'd really like to quote if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So this is from one of my favourite writers, a woman called Gloria Ladson-Billings. Highly recommend. A lot of her stuff is really accessible, despite the fact it's, master's level, PhD level education research. But she says, essentially, the CRT project in education becomes the attempt to, 1, name and discuss the pervasive daily reality of racism in US society which serves to disadvantage people of colour. Expose and deconstruct seemingly colourblind or race-neutral policies and practices which entrench the disparate treatment of people of non-white persons. Legitimise and promote the voices and narrative of people of colour as source of critique of the dominant social order which purposely devalues them. Revisit civil rights law and liberalism to address their inability to dismantle and expunge discriminatory socio-political relationships, and change and improve challenges to race-neutral and multicultural movements in education which have made white student behaviour the norm.
Right. Yeah.
So, like, there are bits of that that's like, yeah, that sounds quite complicated. Like, point 4 is a lot of big words. But really, it's just looking at everything we see and sort of questioning it. So no one questions the fact that redlining happened. You know,
right. And redlining is like basically controlling who can buy real estate in certain areas. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, everybody knows the term sundown towns or...
Yeah. Eugene at one point was one, and basically anybody of color is not allowed after dark to be outside. And so, I mean...
And it's a question of why were those things. So, and the idea of, I think the idea of colorblindness is really interesting to me. I don't fully subscribe to Kendi's everyone's, racist. I think everyone has racist biases within them. I urge everyone to take one of those inherent bias tests and realize just how bad you are.
Sure.
But I think just talking about it is important. And I know Aisha touched on this last week. We are now having these conversations. The fact that I'm on your podcast talking about critical race theory.
Right. I mean, we could just talk about football, So
yeah.
No, but I think it's important to think about with critical race theory, with examining, the history and of systematic racism. It's useful because anybody that has seen legislation pass, like when you talk about the civil rights laws over in history, anytime anything is passed, it's not good. It's a compromise, between the people that want it and the people that don't. So with civil rights, there's been gains and progress made, but it's not like they're like, oh, in 1860, slaves were freed, and in 1960, racism ended. Like that's not how it worked. You know what I'm saying? There's these little gains towards, and right now we're looking at the Voting Rights Act. And it's going to be if it passes at all, it's going to be a compromise. So when people, that's one of the things that I hear for the gripe about like critical race theory. They're like, this is a thing of the past. This is over with. And it's just not true,
It's not. And as a history teacher, social studies teacher, I live in the past.
Right.
To an extent, I'm fascinated by history. And actually that was one of the things that really brought me to want to teach in the States. Like, I'm fascinated by particularly US racial history.
Sure.
Because it's not what I was taught back home. We were taught about the slave ships. We were taught about, Scotland's role in the slave trade.
Yeah.
And then, I came here and it's like, some slaves, they went on picnics. Sorry, and actually enslaved people is the term we should be using. Because slave would suggest, and that's something that, that's using your language. Right. So slave versus enslaved person. Slave would suggest that that's all they are. They're nothing but a slave.
Yeah.
Enslaved person suggests that they are a person.
That it's against their will.
That it's happening to.
Yeah.
And so that's another aspect of the sort of critical race theory and, culturally relevant pedagogies is acknowledging those little microaggressions.
Yeah.
And saying, okay, well, yeah. Let's change how we talk about things. And I do think that is happening. I just think there's such a pushback with this sort of culture war on the right. And the right have admitted this. They've said as much, that it's about if everything's CRT, you can fight against anything.
Right. All you have to talk about is CRT and socialism, and then, you're going to win elections. So. And
this is the first time I think I've really understood what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, there's been other times like, it took me years to understand trickle-down economics. And actually, in the end, I was like, oh no, I understood it. I just realized it didn't work.
Yeah, I saw a meme
Yeah.
one time, and it's my favorite about trickle down economics, and it's a mom and a daughter, teenage daughter, or whatever, and she asked the mom, probably like middle school age, she asked the mom, "How does trickle down economics work?" And the mom says, "Well, the 1% gets all the money," and then the daughter says, "And then what?" And the mom says, "No, that's it." So yeah,
Yeah.
so you'd
And
mentioned
so,
races real quick, or go ahead,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so the fact that I understand, and don't get me wrong, I am by no means an expert on CRT.
Sure.
I use it as a framework, and we apply it, you know, and use it, sort of the way I've explained in the Latest and Billings article. But to kind of vaguely be like, actually, no, that's not CRT, and I know it's not CRT because I've written articles on it.
Right. Well, and I think it's good when with you as a teacher here, there's a benefit to learning the material with the students. I mean, not that you have a better understanding, obviously, you'll be prepared before the student walks in the classroom, but it's also an experience where you can come from an outsider's perspective, evaluating it. And we're evaluating the past. It's not, I mean, there is things that are still true today, but yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this whole thing goes. I think there's just so much misinformation about it.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one thing, like on the teaching front, if there's any aspiring teachers listening, the best bit of advice I got from my department chair was, as long as you're a page ahead of the kids, you can teach them.
Right, exactly. So I want to talk a little bit about, you had mentioned the UK and Scotland's involvement in the slave trade. Let's talk a little about some of the similarities between the racism in America and the racism in the UK. Because
Yeah.
a lot of Americans don't know. I mean, it's a lot of these stories started with England and England's colonization of the entire globe. And I know
The sun never set in the British Empire.
yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of racism alive and well in the UK, and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I grew up, as I say, I grew up in a mining community in Scotland. I should say former mining community, because Thatcher made good on her threats to destroy our mine by using MI5. But that's an entirely different story. And I'm not even going to put allegedly. Stella Remington, come for me. So I grew up in a white town. We had, so I had a high school of about 1,200 kids. There were maybe 10 East Asian, primarily Chinese descent, and they were Scottish. But their families were from East Asia. Same with South Asia. We maybe had a few more, but again, all second, third generation Scots. I remember we had one black kid, and she joined when I was in fourth year. Everybody was like, "Oh my god, there's a black kid," and like not in a, "Oh, there's a black kid," like, we have a black kid now.
It's just different, yeah.
Yeah, and so I grew up like that was always my sort of take. I wouldn't call it colour blindness. I've always been aware of race, but as I grew, started going to the bigger cities like Edinburgh's 500,000, Glasgow about 800, and they do have much bigger sort of multicultural populations. That being said, Edinburgh's like 12% diverse.
Yeah.
So it's small populations. And like, yeah, I grew up, there was races. I grew up with a guy who used to be a really good friend of mine. And I remember, I hadn't seen him for years. I was working in a grocery store as a student, and he came in and he had I was like, "Oh, how you doing, man?" He was like, "Oh, I've been better." Like, and he showed me his ankle, and he had one of those tracking tags on.
Right.
I was like, "What have you done?" And he was like, "Racist assault." And I was like, "Come on, man! Like, you're better. You know better than that."
So
And
he was
like,
charged with like bias, essentially.
"Oh yeah, so he'd assaulted someone and it was racially aggravated.
Wow.
He'd attacked someone because they were Asian."
Wow.
And so there was always instances like that. And as I sort of grew up, went to college, we had the SDL and the EDL and the BNP. So you're going to hear a lot of acronyms. So the SDL and the EDL, the Scottish Defence and the English Defence Leagues. Same thing, like Proud Boys, but more knuckle draggy, if
Right.
that's possible.
Yeah.
Same with the BNP and then UKIP. They were like the political wings of those parties, and they were very much like, we're not racist. It's like, but you all were part of the National Front back in the 70s and 80s, which was, real race issues back then.
Right.
And you're right. A lot of it stems from colonialism. The people that emigrated to the UK were generally people who were in the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at, so recently there was the Windrush scandal. There's a group of people from the Caribbean who'd came over and were being denied citizenship, despite the fact they'd been there since like the 60s. They'd come with their parents who were British. And there is an element of, like Brexit. Brexit was primarily about race.
Right. Well,
to a
and
greater or lesser extent.
so now sometimes there's a crossover between nationalism and racism. And so how is that, how are they different? Like, how is nationalism different than racism?
So I think and this is interesting. So I would consider myself slightly a nationalist in terms of Scottish nationalism. Mm-hmm. I want Scotland to be independent, but I want Scotland to be independent and open, and I don't care who lives there. Like, it's a very civic nationalism. Whereas I think the other form is almost more patriotism.
Yeah.
And that blind love of your country and need for your country to be yours and be like you.
Right.
And I think the way that changes can be really interesting.
That's a really different distinction, because I think in America, patriotism is a good thing. It should be. It's been bastardized. But nationalism is not, in my opinion. And I would I understand completely why in Scotland it would be a different take, because you're still not a sovereign nation, essentially part of the UK where someone else is making the decisions for the country.
So that's an interesting one, because technically we have a sovereign. Right. We have a queen.
Right.
Right. And that is a separate king or king queendom, essentially, from that of England. It's two crowns. And we had theirs first, I might add.
Right.
They stole ours.
Yeah.
But no, it's fascinating. So in Scotland, like, I'm proud to be Scottish, not because Scotland's the best country in the world or because anything except that, like, I'm proud of what we do. Yeah. I'm really proud of the way we've changed from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really grown as a country. We're a liberal country. We're pretty left wing. We don't pay for prescriptions, for example, like you do in England.
Sure. And if you take care of your people, that's something to be proud of. Is there big issues with like poverty and that kind of stuff?
Don't get me wrong. Yeah, it's not perfect. We have some issues in education. I would say the COVID crisis has been handled relatively well. Like, it's not perfect. The SNP have been in power for 12 years. So that's the Scottish National Party. They're not a racist national party, unlike the British National Party, who were.
Right.
Are.
So now you had mentioned real quick. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Okay. So you had mentioned real quick about, your pride of being Scottish. And now that you're living in America, I'm sure even it's felt even stronger. Though this will become your home, it's still like your roots matter to you. Now you and I had talked before this yesterday about how it's interesting to you how Americans with ancestry in Europe hold on to their original, quote unquote, original national pride generations later. So I'm Irish and I talk about it a lot. I mean, I've kind of made my identity based on that, and it's a couple generations back. So talk about how that's really interesting to you to see how Americans kind of decipher their original, quote unquote, national pride if they came from Europe.
I think it's because y'all are national immigrants. Like, you are. There are only some Americans.
Right.
And none of them claim to be Irish.
Right. Seriously.
And I understand it. I used to think it was really weird. I do understand that need to have a history, have a cultural identity. And I think what the issue is in the US is that it quite often is seen as a national identity. But it's not. Like, so for example, my in-laws are Eastern European. Like, the surname is Luch, or Luch. My mother-in-law's family's Hungarian, but they're only Hungarian because it was Hungary at the time. It was actually Austro-Hungary when they left, and my father-in-law is technically Italian-Slovakian. But he talks about just being Eastern European, and I think it's really interesting about when that person came or when that family came, and what part of the ancestry was decided to be important.
Right.
And I get, like, you know, I think there is an element of wanting to hold on to your past, wanting to hold on to your ancestry, and make sense of it, this new place that your family are in. And like, yeah, I've actually have more family here in the States than I do back home on one side. My great granddad and his brother moved to the US in 1904.
Wow.
Went
Yeah.
through Ellis Island, and like me and my brother went and saw Ellis Island, saw where they came through, like saw their things. Really cool.
Yeah.
Like, and I like the family here talk about that.
That's how my
My great
family came through,
granddad,
is Ellis Island. Yeah.
yeah, great granddad lasted 6 months. He was like, "Nah, I'm out. This isn't for me." Went back home. His brother stayed married, had 10 kids, and you know, so I'm actually going to Pride this afternoon with my cousin on that side of the family, and he's like, "I'm really interested. Like, I know I'm Scottish, but like, I don't know what that means." And I think people like you, I think you probably have more of a understanding of what culturally Irish is.
Oh yeah, I don't know a ton about Scotland at all. I know a little bit about Ireland. I'm gonna learn a lot more. I'm going there here soon, hopefully. But yeah,
Yeah. But I think like you have a bit more of an understanding of what that actually means. It's not just "Woo, St. Patrick's
sure.
Day." Um, you know, you do have a bit more understanding. I think that's all I'd like for people to say is like if they're like, "Oh, I'm Scottish," like, all right, cool. Like, because I get a lot people like, "Oh, I'm Scottish." I used to get a lot when I was an admissions rep and talking to kids, and they'd be like, "Actually, I'm going to do the American accent. I apologize to all your listeners." They'd be like, "Hi, I'm Scottish." It's like, are you though? Are you? Like,
Right.
yeah, my grandfather was a MacLeod. Do you know them? It's like, no.
No, do you know them? Yeah. That's like when you talk to someone from Minnesota, you're like, "Oh, so you're from Minnesota? Do you know Prince?" So, I'm gonna play a quick little ad spot for my sponsor, and then we're gonna talk about your Australian political podcast. So we'll be right back after the on the other side. The Spent the Rent podcast is sponsored by Oregon Cashflow Pro, featuring Wealth Care Wednesdays, the live stream, a Q&A on all things finance. Go to OregonCashflowPro.com to find out more. More wealth, less debt, fast at Oregon Cashflow Pro. So this will be fun. We're going to talk about a podcast. It's called Don't Tell the Pilot, that you are a part of, that is primarily based in Australia. And this is the irony, is that you are the American correspondent, or one of the American correspondents, which is hilarious to me. And so tell me about the podcast, what it's about, what you guys do. Yeah, talk on that.
So, yeah, we're Don't Tell the Pilot, Australian Politics podcast. It's so much like me, my brother doesn't live in Scotland. He's based in Brisbane with his wife and daughter. And one of his best mates, TJ, who is our podcast producer, presenter, etc., was we got really drunk, and he'd been talking about doing a podcast for a while, and so they started doing it. And he's got a couple of friends who are Aborigines. His sister pops in from Paris, and you know, they take a look at what's happening in Australia that week or that fortnight, that 2 week period, and it's sort of rotating set of guests. So I was out there the Christmas before the election. No, that can't be right. I was out there like a few years before the election, and Tom was like, you need to come on and talk to us about America. Stuff's going on. Like, if you're going to be out there, I need you on there." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And nothing came of it. And then about 6 months later, Tom was like, "Hey, you still interested?" So I used to get up and record with him at 4 a.m. in Austin. And it got to the point where I was like, why don't I just do American-based episodes?
Yeah, it's pretty rad. I listened to a little bit of it, and anyone can find it anywhere on any streaming site. It's called Don't Tell the Pilot. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of parallels, again, between America and Australia and what's happening with their media. Anybody unfamiliar, Rupert Murdoch, who I'm not sure his role anymore with Fox News, but he was the founder of Fox News. He's basically doing to Australia what he did to the U.S. by spreading disinformation. And it's really interesting to see a rise of kind of far-right extremism in Australia. And you could talk about that a little bit more too.
Yeah, so what I think is really interesting is that Morrison, who's the Prime Minister, has turned into some sort of like pound shop Trump.
Yeah.
So Morrison is real Pentecostal religious. and he's allowing a lot of that to dictate his policy regarding COVID, I think. So, I mean, there was huge anti-vax protests in Sydney the other week there.
Wow.
And it's like, well, we're still in the middle of a pandemic.
We're in the worst part of it, actually.
Yeah. And I follow Sky News Australia, which is this, the equivalent. Sky is what, sort of Foxtel use generally abroad. And I follow it on my podcast account just for interest. And there's times where I read it, I'm like, this is a parody account? No, this is the real account. Because some of their hot takes are like Fox News.
It's the same thing,
And that's Murdoch. He did the same with Brexit. He does his little puppet dance, and he's so powerful that, he owns so many British and Australian politicians, and I've no doubt American politicians.
Yeah.
And he gets them to do their bidding, and he's rich enough. He is 1%. He is. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Succession.
I'm not sure.
But I would highly recommend. It's based on the Murdochs.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. That's the thing. It's like people don't understand that when these media conglomerates, basically, they have so much control that I did an episode on the podcast about global populism a couple years ago now. And this is not just in America, like the Trump global populism. It's everywhere, and they talk about it as we had mentioned this earlier. It's patriotism. No, it's nationalism, and it's like the America First stuff is actually pretty dangerous rhetoric. I mean, the sentiment is fine, whatever. I get that it sells, but it's the goal is division, is literally defining who is an American and who is not. So who is a second-class citizen? And that's definitely the whole. You watch Fox News, I always think about it as if you close your eyes and you think about who an American is. It should not be one person. It should not be a white male. It should be a Hispanic farmer or a Latinx senator. You know what I mean? Like, it should be every area of class, color, everything. And so it's really scary when you have these places that are dominated by a white population. I don't know a lot about Australia, but much like Scotland, it is very much a white population, right?
I mean, partly because the British were incredibly exceptional at eradicating our Aborigines.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a really interesting. Like, if you look at the twist between New Zealand and Australia, the Maoris, so the native New Zealanders, were warriors. They were respected to a greater or lesser extent by the Brits, whereas Aborigines weren't warriors, so they just slaughtered them.
So in New Zealand, they've been able to maintain some of that kind of
to a greater or lesser extent. And don't be wrong, there are still a lot of the issues there. I'm definitely whitewashing to an extent there. But one of the things that Australia's seen a lot of immigration as well, but the racism there is really, it's still very on the nose.
Yeah.
My brother, when he first got there was these guys at his work talking about immigrants. I don't like immigrants, but are immigrants. And he's like, white Scottish guy here, immigrant, hiya, but you're fine, you're white, you speak English.
And that's a problem.
And that was in a corporate office, And I remember him his company were doing a big push on social justice and racial equity. And they had a petition in the boardroom that people could sign. So Andy had been off a few days, went up, signed it, realised that very few of his team had signed it. So sort of walked down. It's like, y'all have got until the end of the day to sign that petition. If you don't sign that petition, I don't want to see you back here tomorrow.
Right.
And it's that, like, they will use slurs in ways that, the majorities would never consider. And it's almost like, 1970s Britain.
Yeah.
Where, like, I remember, like, when I was young, my grandparents would say things that, like, you're like, oh,
yeah,
no.
But that still exists. I mean, I've with England, I've read about the papers in England, like the tabloids, more or less, but it's a huge thing. It's like much bigger than in the United States, right?
Yeah,
And I've heard
so
that they still use slurs on like headlines. That.
some of them will. So the Mail Online, that gossip. I don't know if your partner reads it. My other half occasionally does. Like fashion, all that kind of stuff. The Daily Mail is evil. The Daily Mail was founded by a fascist.
Yeah.
It's founded by Oswald Mosley, who was the first non-German to be invited to dine with Hitler after his rise to power.
Right. The only thing off the record or off the point, but my girlfriend, to answer what you were saying, the only thing that she reads is COVID numbers.
But it's one of those things. I found a lot of American, and it's because, don't get me wrong, Daily Mail style section I think is supposed to be very, very good. And a lot of people here don't realise that the Daily Mail is an evil, evil, evil organisation.
Yeah.
And you're right. The Sun, which is Murdoch-owned, can't be is barely sold in Liverpool because they told some pretty horrific lies about Liverpool fans, the soccer fans, after the Hillsborough disaster back in 1986, where like 97 of them died. These are, and they still trade on this. The Sun and the Mirror. So Piers Morgan, your man, who likes a daytime TV show,
he's terrible.
He was responsible for hacking the voicemail of a dead child who'd been murdered and not found yet.
Wow.
Allegedly.
Yeah, Piers Morgan is disgusting, but
these people run those organizations and they have no qualms about driving that need for hatred among some of the right. And I see it here on Fox News and OAN, and Britain tried to have their own version of that recently as well, and it was as hilariously bad as you would.
Yeah, I fortunately have never really digested anything on OAN, America Only, or whatever it is. I don't even care. And then there's Newsmax, and all these new news channels. And I'm a believer in free speech, and so I do believe that people need to be able to they can have their voice, but it's kind of important for people to also educate themselves on what they're being told.
I mean, that's something actually, like, just going back to the differences between home and here. We have pretty much freedom of speech in Scotland as well, but there's an understanding that, yeah, you have the right to say something, but you don't have the right to a platform, and you don't have the right to any consequences of what you've said. So if you're tweeting about how much you hate black people or something, and your boss sees that, you've got the right to say it.
And that's
but
the
you
same
don't have
here.
the right to keep your job.
And that's the same here. Like people talk about cancel culture, and realistically, cancel culture is societal. It's not. I mean, there's you can't just there's. I mean, first of all, employment at will in most states. I know Oregon is. So if they want to get rid of you, they can just get rid of you. So there's different things with contracts, but so I want to talk about one more thing before we get out of here. But I do want to remind people. The podcast, the Australian Political Podcast, is really interesting, especially for people like me and Americans that are not familiar with the landscape of Australian and global politics. So check out Don't Tell the Pilot. It's really funny and fun, and it's lighthearted and stuff. The stuff that I read, I mean, it's pretty brutal, but it's good. It's good.
We are pretty savage. So that's one thing I want to mention. Like me, Colin, is different from Col in Eugene.
Okay, Colin Eugene is the character, and I did link the Twitter, your Twitter handle. So if people want to see some of your musings on Twitter, I'm sure it's pretty fun.
What I would call is Colin Eugene's almost like a caricature of me.
Right.
Colin Eugene's the non-pragmatic, the let's put everybody up against the wall socialist, whereas I'm the pragmatic Keynesian. Like, I understand that we can't completely dismantle capitalism.
Right. So now I want to talk about this before we get out of here. Trump and Scotland. So Trump and the golf courses, golf resorts, he's in a little bit of hot water right now.
Yeah, he is.
And so I know that there's a lot of people that salivate anytime a headline is dropped that like Trump is under investigation. Tell us a little bit about what's happening with Scotland and Donald Trump.
So just get a wee bit of background on that. So Trump bought, or had bought or tried to buy land, put in planning permission up near Aberdeen, which is up north-east coast. Big oil city, traditionally a lot of money because of that. And there was planning issues. He wanted to build it next to sand dunes that were protected for environmental reasons. He wanted to build land that would require him to have bought 4 family farms. And there was one guy who was just like, nah, nothing. And there was some bits I actually looked into last night after we spoke. I think it was on the level, him getting the planning permission in the end. It's one of those things that could have went either way. So he got stuff. And then Scotland decided to build a wind farm off the coast of his golf course.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it was to annoy him, but I'm not saying that. And so in true Trump terms, he threw a big huff, demanded they removed, asked the First Minister, which is basically like our president, to step in. He said no. And he refused. He said, well, I will never spend another penny in this country. He then bought a second golf course a few years later. But up front, both golf courses have made terrifying losses.
Yeah.
I mean, they are...
Well, that's the Trump way. You slap your name on it and tell people it's succeeding, but it's not. And so I've read some stuff about money laundering. I mean, there's a lot going on there. So people will have to do their own research, but just Google Trump in Scotland, and it's not a good thing.
One thing I'd say about Scotland doesn't really mess around with money laundering, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We have what are called McMafia laws. Scotland Mafia. Mick.
Right.
It's not McDonald's joke. But the idea was that we can really heavily go after money that's been squirreled away by criminals. And that gives the Scottish Government real power to actually investigate what he's been up to in Scotland and where all that money comes from. And my guess is that it's probably similar places that the money, the IRS and the attorney in New York are looking at. I think Scotland doesn't mess about. And if he claims to be one of us, we will treat him like one of us.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It's not a good thing. And again, he's not protected in Scotland, like he is here by half of the political elite. So we're going to get out of here. Colin, it's really cool to get to know you better. You had talked before we hit record about maybe coming over and playing some bass guitar. So I'm excited about that becoming a reality. Anybody listening, I'm really excited because I'm working on a new album under the name Patty Rose that I'm over the moon about this new project. So keep your eyes peeled and your ears ready for my album. It's called Begin Again. That's coming soon. But for now, we're going to end this with a song, and you handpicked this band. This is a Scottish band, and so tell us a little bit about why you picked this song.
So this is the Dead Sea Souls. They are band from Whitburn, where I grew up. Really good friend of mine, Gary, is the bassist. And actually, they will be going on stage for the first comeback gig in 4 or 5 years in about an hour. So good luck, guys.
I'm sure it'll be rough and rusty. It's blue balls. When bands play right now, they've got blue balls. They've been wanting to play and they haven't. I went and saw NoFX in Colorado and it was garbage. They were really sloppy. It'd been a long time, but I'm sure that they've been practicing.
We'll talk offline about that, Paddy. But yeah, so I really love them. They're kind of really bouncy, ska. I just really love the track that I picked. There's just some really great bass lines in it. Gary's a fantastic bassist.
Yeah, I really dig it. It's really cool. It's kind of like Scottish pop punk, and I love it. Yeah. That's the type of music I love.
Great. They have an album on all your various streaming services, couple of EPs. And if you're listening in Scotland somehow, they are touring. Try and get a ticket.
Sure. Yeah, so the Dead Sea Souls and Colin Johnston, thank you very much. This is
pleasure, my friend.
This is the Dead Sea Souls with the song All Heart.
It's been just 16 days since I last saw these village gates, and I'm seeing St. Wilson on. I've got just 9 more miles to go. Don't let them pressure you. Oh, 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 whoa, oh, oh. Don't let them pressure you. Whoa, oh, oh, whoa, oh, oh, oh. That I shouldn't